I've got about 20 minutes, so I'll be short and hopefully sweet. Are we allowed to take questions as we go? Or?
You can take questions as you go, but we will have a big session.
Yeah, so it's fairly tight, but if there are any burning questions, I'm happy, and Kate's happy for that to happen. So just very quickly, just to remind us that worms are important, if not obviously so. And I think one of the big challenges in worm control in sheep and cattle and other species is basically they're pretty much invisible, and the worms themselves are pretty much invisible unless you do an autopsy and you know where to look and you've got good eyesight. The costs are pretty much invisible, and resistance is pretty much invisible. So unless you deliberately go and look for these things, they'll often go under the radar. So in cattle as well as sheep, worms are pretty, well, and certainly in sheep, worms are number one economically. In cattle, depending how you do the numbers, are pretty close to number one as an animal health problem in cattle, in southern cattle. And just to jump into the sheep world very briefly, so to give you a bit of context, if you like, this is recent work summarising. Don't try to absorb all this information. It's going to be on the website, isn't it? These presentations, and it's in the notes. So don't try to absorb the numbers. This is a brief overview of the sheep drench situation across Australia over the last 2 or 3 years. And just very quickly, there's the older drenches. This is the number of properties, or the number of tests that showed resistance. So the older drenches, close to 100% of properties have resistance. And we get across, this is the mectin group. So ivermectin's the least potent of the mectins in sheep, a lot of properties with resistance. And we get to moxidectin, which is the most potent mectin in sheep, and we now see about half properties. Now that might be biased from where I come from in New England, where we have a lot of resistance, but even I was talking to Vanessa. Where are you, Vanessa? Because I'll mention you later on. I was talking to Vanessa that some of our colleagues in Dubbo did a survey out there, and you think Dubbo, not many worms, not much resistance, but half the properties had resistance to sidectin. So the take-home message is with sheep is that you just don't assume that a drench is going to work on your property. You need to test. So it's dreadful. Most of you are sheep and cattle producers, or how many are pure cattle producers? So you look down on sheep producers, they've got all these nasty resistance problems. Well, you can't. Well, you can't look down your nose anymore. So it's no longer just about sheep worms, sheep, goats, alpacas. Cattle have a problem too. Now we've known for quite some time there's been a little bit of resistance in cattle. So Eagleson and others, they found the odd case, and we thought, oh, that's very interesting, but it's not really very relevant. And it wasn't in a red hot sort of worm anyway, so no one paid much attention. And then the Kiwis, who not only beat us at rugby on a regular basis, but are very competitive in other ways, they did some work, and Waghorn and others did a survey of 60 odd properties through New Zealand. And again, don't try to absorb the information, but they looked at white drenches, clear drenches, and the mectin drenches, or the families, and a reasonable amount of resistance depending on which worm species you're looking at. So it was certainly there and of concern. So people in Australia that piqued our interest in Australia, and I'll just summarise 2 of the largest surveys, if you'd like to call it a survey, recently. One in Victoria with the blue bars, and one in WA, which are the red bars. And this is the percentage of the properties that showed resistance. And across the bottom here, we've got Osteotagia, which is small brown stomach worm, and we've got the drenches, so BZs, the white drenches, clear drenches, mectin drenches, and Couperia, which is small intestinal worm. So you can see with the Victorian farms, for example, a lot of resistance in that particular trial, less than 95% reduction in worm egg counts after drenching. So levamisole, for example, quite a few, 100%, near enough, and white drenches, quite a few properties, and mectins, Rendell found a number of properties as well. And WA, slightly different sort of numbers, but the take-home message is it's not uncommon, depending on the worm species and the drench, because every drench family has their strengths and weaknesses. So in the case of mectins, you'll first see resistance in Couperia, and with levamisole, its weak point is against Osteotagia, so you'll tend to find resistance first in Osteotagia as a generalisation. So the take-home message from that slide is it's no longer uncommon, it's no longer just a problem in sheep. goats and alpaca. And it's happening in your backyard. So Tony Morton, who most of you would know, and colleagues, am I in the way here? Can you see? They've got some local cases. So they were investigating ill thrift situations in cattle, and they went and looked at their responses to drenches on these properties. And, for example, ivermectin backline on this property, there were a reasonable number of eggs left after treatment, and a property at Wagga with a prinamectin backline, quite a few worms left on a post-mortem of one animal, and also egg counts up to 200 after treatment. So it's happening in your backyard as well. It's not just the New England or WA or the north coast of New South Wales. And we've got a question up the back. Oh no, I can't take one from you.
Was Dave Rendell's mectins, was that done as ivermectin? And is in cattle, is the feeling it's still a higher efficacy from oxydectin than ivermectin?
I think so, but Vanessa might answer that one. But just to point out, I'm pretty sure it was ivermectin, and in both trials they were at pains to use oral drenches as well, because there's a few differences. But you're getting some results with moxidectin too, aren't you, Vanessa?
We're actually seeing that I think the current thoughts that the hierarchy system of the EOS in terms of potency of the sheep isn't turning out the same way in cattle. We're actually seeing a lot of patients with moxidectin resistance known through the EOS mentality. And agreement seems to be coming out pretty well. Couple of problems with some resistance showing up, but it tends to be doing as well. So, you know, where ivermectin sits in that, it's a little bit better than the moxidectin. Whether that's the way we use moxidectin or whether there is a difference in that potency between the EOS and cattle.
Now, you may not have heard all that, but really that's all right. But the take-home message is, if you forget everything else that's been said, is to get into testing on your property to see what works, if you forget everything else. And I'll mention that again at the end. But there are some funny differences between the mectins in sheep. We know moxie is the most potent and so on, and it's a little bit different in cattle. So, but the most important thing is to know it works on your property. And just on fluke, liver fluke, does anyone in liver fluke country here?
Yep.
There are.
For sure.
Actually, the first reported case of resistance to triclobendazole was from this region. So there you go, you're famous. So resistance to liver fluke. Now we know that there's. Well, basically, we don't know how common it is in sheep or cattle, and it's sporadic. So it's happening. Don't know how much there is. In sheep, it's in triclobendazole, like trade names like Fascinex. You know, you're familiar with the fluke drenches with triclobendazole in it. And this family here, which is, anyone remember Ranide? Anyone old? Oh, you're not old enough to remember Ranide. I am. And Closantel, which goes under names like Saponva and whatever. So sheep, we've found resistance, the odd case around the traps, in both those families, and in cattle there's triclobendazole resistance being found. And CSU locally has been doing some work with a new test and looking at liver fluke resistance in cattle. And maybe people like Rob Woodgate and others can tell you more about it. Rob's from CSU. So if you're in fluke country, what can you do? So if you want to know if the fluke drench was efficacious, you should do a fluke worm egg count, ideally on the day of treatment, so you've got a benchmark to work from, and also 28 days later. Some people say 21 days, but so 28 days. So to get a handle on how effective the fluke drench was. And I think that pretty much covers that bit on fluke. That's about all I know about liver fluke resistance.
That's just a straight fluke drench, is it? Not a combination?
Triclobendazole?
Just a straight Vasnex or something?
It comes as combinations as well. So Fassi...
That particular data, is that on just a straight?
Probably both.
Right.
So there would have been cases with Fassi-Mec, which is ivermectin and triclobendazole. Yep. Yeah. So it's a broad spectrum endoflucicide, as you know. Yep. So we're getting towards the end here, so it's going to be a nice short presentation. If you want help, this is simple stuff, but if you want help, there are a lot of people who are willing to help you do this quick and dirty test of just doing an egg count after a routine drench, but you can also set up more rigorous drench trials if you like, and there are a lot of people who can help you. So in no particular order, the local LHPA, which of course is going to change. Some private vets are interested. A lot of drench companies are very proactive, and we've got Vanessa Watson here from Merial, who is looking for cooperators. Vanessa's up the back. You might see her at morning tea. And they've been very active, as have other companies, in testing efficacy of drenches. So they might be able to help you out. And quite a few rural resellers are very good at helping producers out with checking drench efficacy. So we're on to the last slide now, pretty much the last slide. So drench resistance in cattle, it's here and it's likely to get worse. What can you do with checking for roundworm resistance? You do an egg count 14 days after a drench, and preferably one on the day of the drench as well. That's a quick and dirty way of checking drench efficacy. So that might cost you $50 to $100 in lab charges, say, depending on how you do it. That's not a bad investment. Consider rotating drenches. Like Mectins are really nice drenches, and they're really good against small round stomach worm. But if you keep using the same drench all the time, you probably get resistance faster. So consider rotating broad spectrum drenches between different families. Now you need to, first thing you need, that assumes you know it works in your property. So it's the same with sheep producers. Their biggest issue is they don't know it works in their property. So you can't have a sensible rotation if you don't know it works. So you need to get into the habit of doing some of these quick and dirty drench checks, if not a full-blown drench resistance trial.
You might like to just expand that point out, because you've got plenty of time still.
Oh, have I?
With regard to the families and things. You've got 8 minutes.
Okay, so, and you know where the families are, the broad spectrum families that you need, that you're looking at. You've got the white drenches. White drenches, they're not pretty good against Cuperia. They're not too bad against brown stomach worm, but they're not really great against the inhibited stages. They're only about 70 or 80% effective. The Mectin ML drenches are really good against Osteotagia, including the inhibited stages, but they're not so great against Cuperia. So they've all got their strengths and weaknesses, but they're the 3 major families you're looking at.
And in this district, when I did a bit of a phone call around, there's less than 5% of people using anything except
Mectins.
Yes,
Yeah, we know
which
that.
means people are not rotating currently.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
2/10 of no one doing it.
Yep.
Which, you know, is setting us up for a big train smash. And once we have ineffective drenches, you can't bring them back. They're gone.
They all have their pros and cons, and also the formulations, obviously. So everyone likes porons, which is great. I would use a poron as well. But you need to think about rotation, or even better, in my opinion and that of many others, is to use combinations of unrelated actives. And the only one in Australia currently is Eclipse. And I'm getting no kickbacks from Vanessa on this, because it's her company that makes Eclipse. That's Merial. It's a combination of avamectin and levamisole, so 2 unrelated families. There is some information that shows that the route of administration in some situations might have an effect on efficacy of drench. There's more information. That's been known for 20 odd years or longer. It's been known in fluke drenches. So route of administration can have some effect. But in Australia, we don't have a lot of options with other than porons. And I know a lot of you won't like to use something other than a poron. But it's something to keep in the back of your mind. I think more information will come out about that.
Can't we?
Pardon?
We can get injectables?
Yeah, but, yep. In this trial, the injectables were no better than the porons, actually. But anyway, we can, but... So there's a few issues there, but just keep it in the back of your mind. But with the current situation, the only combination is this one, Eclipse, in Australia. New Zealand's got more options.
Is it possible then, like people of our way, use the 2 drenches at once, just 2 different products, and combine white drench and a Mectin at the same time?
Given which way?
Oral and back lines at the same time.
Yeah, it's possible.
And the crush, and just 2 different products, so you don't have I'm not
Yeah, you can do it.
I know, I'm just saying like that you
Yeah, you can do that.
buy two different products.
Yeah, you can do that. I'm not sure how many people would like to do that.
Well, I guess it comes down to the economics.
It'll certainly work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Particularly if you know which ones work on your property.
Well, that's
Yeah. So that's a possibility. It's pretty messy, but in the interim, I think we'll get more products that give you some more options. That's what I'm guessing. And just briefly, not talking about resistance in particular, but with weaners, and this is particularly in high rainfall country, you need a good worm control program because, unfortunately, worm egg counts aren't as good in cattle as they are in sheep. Give you an idea of worm burdens. They're still useful, but on their own, they might lead you astray, particularly with respect to productivity. So there was some work in Victoria and Central Tablelands that showed even at low egg counts, even like 50 eggs per gram in weaner cattle, you could still have effects from worms on production. So you need something apart from worm egg counts. You need a good strategy, and you also need to be objectively measuring production. So you actually know how fast your cattle are growing, not just relying on egg counts as a guide to how worms are affecting your production. Monitoring weight gains, and consider grazing management. So since the Mectins came out, they're really nice drenches, but most people just gave up grazing management. So rotating cattle with sheep, or not putting young cattle in, weaning them into paddocks that had young cattle in them within the last 4 to 6 months, those sorts of things. And don't forget liver fluke. So for those of you who have liver fluke. That's actually my last slide. So I said it to be short.
Do we have any questions?
One strategy that you've overlooked completely is selection. Selection for resistance.
In host resistance?
In host resistance.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Charles Sturt Uni that did the research that showed it's feasible in Angus cattle. Certainly in tropically adapted cattle it is feasible. The biggest issue is that the economic impact is short-lived. At least in tropical cattle, it's only for the first post-weaning dry season that's the real impact, and unless there are other stressors operating, then by the time cattle get to a proportion of their mature weight, then worm resistance is no longer a problem. And I'm just wondering if there's any work there and why you haven't even considered.
Well, because it's a fairly short talk.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd major on the major things. Certainly if this was a talk on sheep, I'd be not rabbiting on, but I'd be talking about selecting rams with a favourable Australian sheep breeding value for WEC.
Yeah.
So, but cattle have an advantage. They're more innately resistant to internal parasites than sheep and goats and alpacas. So if it was a longer talk, I'd mention that, and if it's the sheep talk, it'd be right up there as well. Yeah. So host resistance of the animals to worms is a bonus if you can put it into your strategy.
It's going to give you an alternative to resistance of the parasites to the drenches.
Yeah, and as always, you have to balance this with all the other production traits. You're getting the right selection pressures, of course, as you know, for different traits.
Right. We've got one more quick question at the back there.
Why are worm egg counts not as reliable in cattle as sheep?
I think it's because cattle have more innate resistance to worms than sheep. So they're better at, their immune response kicks in earlier. So soon after weaning, the egg counts start dropping. So I think, first of all, they just got a stronger immune response than sheep do, in general. So initially they start hammering the worms, so their egg count drops, egg output drops. The worms, they don't live as long, and then eventually the worm larvae don't establish so much. So I think that's the reason.
Excellent. All right, if we can, just one quick question, then we'll save any more questions for the panel session.
I'll just make a comment. That was excellent, Steve. The difficulty is that there's no real information other than first principles to support rotating drenches as far as decreasing as opposed to combining drenches. And in the absence of combinations readily available, it makes it very difficult. The rotating drenches that no one's looking at cattle, but in sheep, if you use a drench for 10 years versus another drench for 10 years, or alternate terminate those drench every 10 years, at the end of 20 years, the information is you're going to be roughly at the same point. It's not going to change. So, well, I mean, that's all you can suggest at the moment, but even the science on that, it's difficult for both scientists and producers to know what to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly the same situation at 86 with sheep, and I mean, if we used combinations earlier, it might work a lot longer.
Yeah. Even if rotating drenches doesn't keep drenches alive for longer, I think there's still a benefit in doing it.
If you rotate onto something that's working, not off something that's...
Yeah. The reason I say that is that the first property that... Sorry, Kate, the first property that had cydectin resistance in sheep in Australia, he just used cydectin exclusively from 95. For 6 years he had worm control phases. He wiped out the drench. Now, had he rotated that drench, so instead of... He might have been able to use it, say, in his weaners or in high-risk Barber's poleworm situations for, say, 10 years instead of 6 years, and he may have exported resistance to his neighbours later. So even if he got the same number of uses out of it, but spread it over a bigger period of time, I think it would have been beneficial to him and also to everyone, his neighbours and the person who used his shearing shed and so on. So, but as you would say, the argument for using combinations is believed to be pretty strong. And it's mostly based on modelling, but combinations of unrelated chemicals is a good way to go. Thanks.